I'm so delighted for you to meet Steve Zolno, who is the author of The Future of Democracy, which is now in its fourth printing. I'm rather impressed by that. Lessons from the past and present to guide us on our path forward. He graduated from Shimer College with a bachelor's degree in social sciences and holds a master's in educational psychology from Sonoma State. He has founded and directed private schools and a healthcare agency in the Bay Area, and currently is a management and educational consultant and trainer, and has led workshops on democracy for over 10 years, which emphasize how democratic principles can be brought more clearly into all areas of human interaction, including government, organizations, schools, families, and our private lives. Now, democracy is a pretty hot topic right now. And in the preface, in my little marking here, I kept coming back to this, where he has said, democracy is the faith that people can participate in their own self-governance and make it work. So simple, and yet, clearly we're finding out that it's not as easy as we think it is. I doubt that very many people could have really kind of thought that we'd go to this extent with our last election, that our democracy would perhaps be affected quite as much as it has been. And since the future is just so unpredictable, I think it's really wise that Mr. Zolno has looked to the past to see what the path forward is going to be like. So please welcome Steve Zolno.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for being here, and thanks to Laurel Books for sponsoring this talk. So I'm Steve, and yeah, this is my book, The Future of Democracy, now in its fourth edition. And I want to tell you a little bit about how this book got written, and then give you a little bit about a little summary about the book, and then also talk a little bit about what the future may hold, depending on what we do to make to ensure democracy for ourselves and our country. So in 2006, a group of friends and myself were talking about how we would react to what the president at that time said about democracy. Anybody remember who the president was? 2006, George Bush, yeah. And he said that he represented real American values. Does anybody remember him saying that?
Yeah.
He did say that, yeah. So we said, well, let's check this out. So we got together and we did some research. Where did American values come from? Well, American values, or the basic democracy that our country was, democratic principles our country was founded on. Of course, there was Washington, and there was Jefferson and Adams and a number of others. And where they got a lot of their ideas was from what they called Enlightenment authors. And they wrote that basically people should be free to overturn a government if they thought that it was not providing their needs, if they thought it was an unjust government. So, and John Locke was one of the people who said that. And you might think, well, this is all pretty airy-fairy philosophical stuff, but they were, the people who founded our country, they were very into reading this stuff, and they were very into trying to understand what direction to take in this new country. But first of all, they wrote the Declaration of Independence, where they talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they had one of their earliest revolutions, although there had been other revolutions in many countries for thousands of years, but they were not among the poor in their country. They were among the elite. So you might think, well, why would these guys who are doing pretty well, you probably know that a number of them also had slaves. Washington had slaves, and Jefferson had slaves, which wasn't emphasized in history when I was a kid, but they did. And why would these people be interested in having a revolution? And the reason is because these people, the philosophes, people who were the philosophers that came out of England and France, came up with these ideas, and they realized that they felt that they were somewhat oppressed, by the practices of the English government at that time, and then they decided that they wanted to overthrow the influence of that government. So that's basically what happened, and about half the people at that time were not even interested in revolution. They're pretty happy with the way things are. So they had to really sell their case, and then when they had the actual revolution, they almost lost a number of times, or a number of battles, and where they came very, very close. So they get very, very lucky as as some of them actually realized that if they didn't win the revolution, they would all be hung. So that sort of motivated them to really work hard to make this work. So a little bit more about the book, going back to 2006, we got together, we studied about the influences on the founders, and I call them founders, not the founding fathers, because a lot of their wives, Abigail Adams, Martha Washington, a lot of their wives also were very, very influential in inspiring their husbands to do what they did. So going back a little bit further, they also studied the Greeks, and democracy had its birth in more or less modern times in Greece, going back 2,000 years, and that was in about 2400 BC. The Greeks actually decided to establish democracy because they had a very unequal, just like we had here for a while, very unequal society, and there was a founder of the Greek democratic movement who actually decided to cancel the debts of the farmers who were getting further and further in debt to the wealthy people in Greece. So that's where democracy in Greece started, and they were very, very proud of their democracy. It was centered mainly in Athens, and but that died out after about 200 years. So then fast forward back to the American Revolution. There were a number of people who were willing to fight because they felt oppressed by the British, and then after about 11 years, they had established their independence. The problem was that things started to fall apart. A lot of people don't realize this. They had what was called the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, all the states had their own import-export rules. They had their own relationships with other countries. So things were really very, very tenuous at that time. And then they realized they had to have a forward-looking document. So the American, or the United States Constitution was actually the first constitution that was formed in a democracy. A lot of people don't realize it was the first ever that was formed. And it was forward-looking in that it wasn't just saying, we got to get rid of these people who are oppressive. It was saying, we need to look forward to how we actually can establish laws and rules and principles to help us move forward. And that was the first time that was ever done. If you think about that, that's really, really important, because not long afterwards, we had, for example, the French Revolution. Has anyone ever learned very much about the French Revolution? Wasn't very successful at first. The people who overthrew the king, they guillotined the king, and then they became guillotined. They became overthrown, and they got guillotined. And it went on and on and on like that. So for the first 80 years after the French Revolution, they went back and forth between being a republic and being a monarchy. Napoleon crowned himself king again. So it went back and forth and back and forth. They did not have a forward-looking document like the Constitution that we have, and that's one reason for that. So this is why our Constitution is very, very important. On the other hand, you might think that a Constitution is going to help guarantee the success of a democracy. As I'm sure you know, in this country, the principles of the Constitution were established by the first three words, which are, anybody know the first three words of the Constitution?
We the people.
We the people, right? Okay. So that means basically that you and me and you and you and you, basically we are the basis of the sovereignty of this nation. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? So how many people do you think actually were able to vote in the country first? Not many. Not many, right? Maybe about, going back to Greece, it was maybe about 10%, so we improved on that maybe to about 30%, right? Women couldn't vote, obviously slaves couldn't vote, right? American Indians couldn't vote, so it's maybe 30%. So, actually, quick question was about, do you have to have property? Actually, that was a state law, it was not a federal mandate. So in some states, they did mandate people had to have property, but that idea came out of England originally. So a real important point that I make in the book is that we have our principles and then we have reality. The principle is that we are the people that actually basically are the source for our government. The reality has been that there's always been a certain amount of elite individuals who've held the power. It's gotten better, right? We have, for the most part, people are allowed to vote. There's still ways that people are being kept from voting even as we speak, as I'm sure a lot of you know. In 1919, we had the 20th Amendment, and that allowed for women to vote, so that added about half the people in the country, or at least half the adults in the country, they could vote at that point. So again, we have the principle of democracy. Democracy means we the people. The Greek term, democracy, actually means government by the people. That's where the word actually comes from, and they actually use that word. So let me tell you a little bit about what's in the book. The book starts out with the first chapter. It has a lot about the history of democracy, how we got here, going right up to the year 2000. The second chapter is about democracy's present. Talks about governments around the world, some of which are more democratic and some of which are less democratic. But almost every government in the world has a constitution, with the exception, I believe last time I counted, I think there were 6 countries that did not have constitutions. Now, would you think that China has a constitution? It's not a democracy, is it? China has a constitution. And China's constitution talks about how democratic they are. Isn't that amazing? And Russia's constitution, Russia actually started out along a democratic path after the Soviet Union fell. And they went on for about 10 years. And what happened there was that supposedly everyone owned all the property, right, in Russia. And then when communism fell, the people who were the previous officials, the oligarchs, took over. So they became billionaires, and they ended up with a very unequal society again. So that's kind of where we are in Russia at that point. Russia's constitution talks about how democratic they are and how important it is that the courts are independent. So just to give you some idea about constitutions versus reality, a lot of times there's no correspondence.
Do they believe that they are democracies, or is it really just, this
I
is
was
what we
there.
should say?
I was in Russia about 5 years ago, and a very sad thing, when I was in Moscow, you could almost tell people were walking around almost afraid to say anything or do anything that they might get caught. It's very, very sad. You know? Now, when you get out in the country, or of course I went to a lot of tourist spots and people were interacting with tourists, it wasn't quite like that. But just I went to ordinary shopping centers, ordinary places where people were. So it's a very oppressive society. Imagine if we're having this conversation, right? And KGB, or the equivalent to the KGB, which still exists now again in Russia, they decided to walk in. They say, what are you talking about over there, right? What's this book about? That could happen anywhere in Russia at any time. So that's what's going on in Russia right now. And then about the same time that the Soviet Union collapsed, you probably remember Wet Alexa in Poland and in Hungary. They started moving toward democracy. All on. What's happened is oligarchs again have taken over. In those countries, am I getting depressed? I hope not. You know what happened in Venezuela? They had Hugo Chavez. He was a democratically elected leader. Their economy is in such terrible shape. They're a total autocracy right now. So just because a country has a constitution, just because they're well-founded at the beginning, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to maintain democracy. Which brings us to a country that you may have heard of, the United States. We should probably talk about that a little bit. Does anybody here worry about what's going to happen in the United States?
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of people do. And a lot of the same patterns are happening that happen in those other countries. Basically, have you ever heard our current president, I won't mention any names because I don't know who's listening. Did anybody hear our current president talk about democracy? I've never heard that word come out of his mouth once. Okay. He talks about how much he admires Putin. The president, I'll put the word president in quotes here, the president of China just was declared president for life. And guess who one of his big congratulators was? Trump. Right? Okay. So this is a scary direction, but he can't do it by himself. So I'm getting to the crux of what I really want to talk about here. Nobody can create an autocracy or an authoritarian government by themselves. It requires what I call enablers, right? So remember when our current president was running for office? Remember how many people in the Republican Party said he's really unqualified? Okay, he got more and more popular, and what happened was he won, and all those people just basically put their tails between their legs and collapsed, right? So he has a tremendous amount of enablers, including a lot of Democrats. We'll get into the Democrats in a little while. They haven't been so perfect either, by the way, as far as guaranteeing constitutional rights. So we have a bit of a problem here. So what I'm about, what I'm trying to do is to get people to kind of wake up and say, yeah, these people are enablers, but they don't realize what direction we're going in. You ever hear of a guy called Hitler? Right? Some people consider him to be the personification of evil. He was democratically elected. A lot of people don't realize that. Mussolini, his partner in World War II, he was democratically elected. So all these people were democratically elected, and then they were able to take over based on fears, based on blaming people who they blame for their economies being collapsed. Do you hear anybody currently blaming people for economies going south? The problem is that there are people who genuinely are hurting. In Germany, after World War II, let's go back and look at that for just a second. There were people who genuinely were hurting financially. It's a rough time. Sorry, in between the wars, I'm jumping ahead there. In between the wars, between World War I and World War II, there was a depression, and a lot of voters are economic voters. They'll vote for anyone who they think is going to help them out. So that's what a lot of people did, and they didn't realize what they were getting into. And once you put yourself behind a leader, and you say, this is the guy I'm going to follow. Whatever he does, he can get more and more and more outrageous. And before you know it, you've lost your democracy because people don't realize that I'm basically giving all my power over to this person. So this is why it's very, very important that we think about principles, not supporting people necessarily. You support the person who you think is going to best probably embody those principles. But you don't want to get to the point where you say, this is our leader no matter what. And you don't want to say, I don't know, I can guess, we're in Oakland, I can guess what political party most people are involved with here. But you don't want to say, Democrats, great, Republicans, no good, right? Because I can tell you all kinds of things Democrats have done to make the economy and make the nation a worse place, as well as making the nation a better place, okay? I'd say for the most part, I would probably side with the Democrats, for sure. But people tend to be blind, they tend to follow people and then just vote, and that's it, kind of leave it at that. So the last chapter is about democracy's present, and I go back to a number of different areas, and this would be a good reason to actually get the book, how we bring the principles of democracy into all these different areas. Democracy's future, childhood, education, justice, the economy, the environment, healthcare, religion, science, war and violence, and international relations and politics. So these are all very, very important areas. And as being responsible citizens, if we are going to be responsible citizens, it's up to us to educate ourselves to a certain extent, and also to educate our children. Way back in the 70s, I had a small private school, and I really, really worked to educate those children about the principles of democracy. There's two main areas, I'd say, about democracy that are very important. One is theoretical, what's it about? But the other, for little children, are more likely to get this, to practice it. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. Let's say we decide to go off and start a little group here, right? And how would we run it? Well, it'd be pretty easy to have a democratic system because we could talk about it, right? So you might come up with an idea, you might come up with an idea, and we'd say, hey, we like that. And we'd say, what about combining my idea with your idea? That's kind of, it's very, very simple. That's kind of the way democracy starts, right? So going back to the days when people lived in caves, they had small groups that they lived in. So the more successful they were, probably they took more advantage of different people having contributions. And that's the way any organization that's democratically run can work and work best. Problem is, people have children, children have children, children have, those children have children. Before you know it, you have thousands of people and millions of people. So obviously, thousands of people can't get together in a room and decide, well, let's see, how are we gonna raise the crops next season, right? It's gonna be a little bit rough, right? How are we gonna govern things? What are we gonna do with criminals? So on and so forth. So you have to eventually have leaders, and that's where democracy or the democratic principle gets lost. So this is why in Greece, they were very, very brilliant to try to reestablish that principle. And they actually had a more direct type of democracy. They actually would vote on things like going to war. There were popular representatives and actually vote on things like that, whereas we can't do that anymore. So anyway, the point is that we still have to be educated and we have to be aware of the principles behind democracy. And if we want to keep it going, it's a pretty serious situation, and it could get worse. I think in a lot of ways it is getting worse because there's more and more enablers. Just give you one recent example. Everybody knows about the tax cut bill that was passed in December, right? And a lot of Democrats went along with that. So a very, very important principle in the book here is learning from history. Anybody remember what happened 10 years ago? We came very close to depression. Very, very close. And they threw some money into the, some lubrication into the works, and hopefully got the gears going slowly again. And luckily, we came out of that situation. We came very, very close for the stimulus packages that they used did help to a certain extent. But we came very, very close, and the reason for that was because we gotten rid of a lot of the rules and laws that had helped, since the Depression, that helped to prevent that type of over-speculation, just to make it fairly simple. So, and you know which president signed that law which overthrew all the rules that came out of the Depression? Clinton. Yeah, Bill Clinton. So just because someone's a Democrat or Republican doesn't mean they're necessarily looking after the best interests of democracy. There was a Republican bill, but it was signed by Bill Clinton. So let's see if there's any questions, comments. Disagree with me, it's okay. I like this, I like that part.
I
Yeah,
have one
please.
question.
Yeah.
So the Constitution forward-looking document, is it really? Because things change, attitudes change, customs change. So how forward, and we've questioned that, haven't we? We've looked at, well, this is really archaic and certain aspects of it. So to call it a forward-looking document is all, I'm not quite sure, is it?
It's a good question. Yeah. Okay, so it was very forward-looking for its time. It was totally revolutionary for its time. And even then, they had tremendous disagreements between them. Adams and Jefferson, everybody knows about Hamilton, right? I'll tell you about that, right? Hamilton's playing somewhere, everywhere, right? It's always playing somewhere, so people know about that one. They didn't get along too well. But Adams and Jefferson, you'd think they would get along? They did not get along either. Okay. Adams was a Federalist, Jefferson was an anti-Federalist. Federalism basically is about how strong you want the federal government to be. So point being that just like today, how much has our own government, our own legislators in Washington gotten done in the last year and a half? I think they passed one bill, maybe two. Well, the main one is the tax cut. They may pass one or two other small ones, right? So it's kind of gridlock there. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get to here is that there's always been this disagreement. There's always been this loggerheads. But one thing that they did do after 4 months of writing the Constitution, they wrote in the amendment process, because they knew even back then, for example, slavery, there was a clause in the Constitution, you couldn't even discuss slavery, getting rid of slavery until 1808, right? So that's 30 years hence. No, it's going to be 20 years hence because it was written in the late 1800s. Couldn't even discuss it, right? So that's, of course, always been a very big divisive issue in our country, but what they basically did build in the amendment process, which is really, really good. Because if it couldn't be amended, we have some problems. By the way, the US Constitution is very, very short. It has 9 clauses, I think, and 27 amendments as of this point. If you see books that are published of the Constitution, it's pretty small. Our other countries have hundreds and hundreds of pages to the Constitution because they keep changing, adding to it, and trying to adjust it. But I think one good thing about our Constitution is they try to stay with the principles. But then, of course, you have to have the courts interpret, what the Constitution means. Our Constitution actually is not as specific as many other constitutions.
We gave away copies of the Pocket Constitution for one of our events. And there were middle school kids who came in bravely and said, "Can I have a copy?" And of course we said yes, and gave it to them. They said, "That's it? That's the whole thing?" And they were shocked, even though they'd been studying it. So one of their teachers sent them in, but it's like, yes, you can read this quickly.
Yeah.
Now, but you have to interpret it, so.
Yeah. I just read the whole thing myself, just to remind myself what was in there, just about 3-4 months ago. I have a copy of my bedstand. When I really want to fall asleep, that's what I pick up, right?
I don't think it's clear. I personally,
The Constitution itself?
I read that little bedside thing, and I'm like,
You're right.
what are you really saying?
You're right. You're right. You're right. And the downside of it is that it's not hundreds and hundreds of pages. For example, the Indian Constitution goes on forever. That's just one of many. That's like, and I actually have 11 different countries in here, and I have a lot about their constitutions. The problem is you keep adding things every time that a new issue or a new subject comes up that people hadn't thought about. Let's talk about technology, for example. Right? How to protect people from technology destroying their lives, for example. Can you write that into a constitution? You see, you get larger and larger and thicker, and then you have a court that has to go through and sort of parse all this stuff and figure out what's in there. So it's very general. I think it's kind of good in a way. The downside is that the courts kind of go in a lot of different directions. You'll have different courts disagreeing about how to interpret the Constitution. It gets to the Supreme Court, and then a lot of their decisions are 5-4. So a lot of things are just like very, very narrow in the way they're decided. So that's one possible downside. But the important thing is to keep going back to that principle, the principle of, and I'll put it in a little bit different terms, just the way I put it in the book. What kind of laws should we have, and how should we govern our country in a way that reflects, as much as possible, what's best for the greatest number of people? Which is a little bit different from saying we the people, because some people, when they hear that word we the people, well, what do you mean by we the people? Again, that's vague. You have a good point there. Is we the people who wrote it? Is we the people who have a lot of money? Is it my party? Is it my religion or my ethnic group versus yours? Okay, so I think that's what they meant. In fact, I can say, pretty much having studied a lot, that is what they meant. But people let's go back to Greece for a minute, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about. In Greece, they had slaves. And it never occurred to them. If Greece conquered a small island, Athens conquered a small island nation that disagreed with them, they would turn them into slaves. Okay, it wasn't actually so much, it wasn't Greeks versus Romans versus Africans versus whatever, but it was basically which particular city-state you came from. So they would have slavery, and it never occurred to them that there might be something wrong with slavery. And then here, of course, we had slavery right at the beginning. And it did occur to a lot of the founders that slavery was a bad thing, particularly in the North. But guess who had slaves? Washington, right? Jefferson. These people all had slaves. So I guess what I'm saying is that we have principles, we have ideas we try to live by, and we fall far short. I don't know about you, but I do. I think most people do fall far short of what their ideals are. And then you wake up and you realize, oh, that really doesn't fall in line with what I think democracy should be. And this is why we have 27 amendments. It was assumed that women, no offense, it was assumed that women weren't smart enough to vote when the country was first started, right? And that was a stereotype, based on the fact that women were stuck in menial positions, they were stuck being housewives. So that was just an assumption. It's like backwards, right? Instead of looking at the fact or the reality of whether women actually could hold good jobs, whether they were smart, they didn't look at that, right? They just assumed that they couldn't because they weren't in good positions. That's sort of a reverse sexism, but that's kind of the way it worked. So last, it took all those years, marching, a tremendous amount of protests in England. They had suffragettes. They did very violent things, and people were against that. But eventually here in England, and eventually in France, women were able to vote. But it took a long time to wake people up, just to realize. And it wasn't just men. You ever hear of Phyllis Schlafly?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, she thinks that women should stay home and, basically scrub the floors. That's her movement. So people buy into that, and they buy into the stereotypes. So this is why it's very, very important. Keep going back to one of the principles. The principle of democracy is that everyone is capable of doing good things, everybody is capable of being smart, everyone is capable of accomplishing things. And for me, getting over my stereotypes is a challenge, because I realize if you watch yourself, okay, walk down the street, okay? Walk down the street and see who you identify with, right? You say, oh, I think I can get along with that person, probably not that person. You ever do that? Right? We kind of put ourselves in groups. It's a tribal thing, it's sort of a natural thing that people do, right? So it's not just people make us do it, or people are bad because they do it. It's sort of a human thing. It probably goes back to the time when we were all tribes, coming out of Africa, and we identified with one tribe. By the way, people think that those are peaceful times. No, they have found skulls that were pierced going back 10,000 years and further. So it goes back a long, long time, this tribalism and thinking that I'm right, you're wrong, and it probably had a certain, from the point of view of evolution, it probably had a certain survival aspect to it. Basically, this is how my tribe survives, by defeating your tribe. And the idea of democracy is moving past that tribalism, moving past the idea that I'm better than you, my group is better than you, my race is better than you, my religion is better, kind of moving past that. It's not easy to do because, okay, I won't tell you how you think, but I know this is the way a lot of people think. It's sort of natural to think that my group is a little bit better than your group, and that's kind of what you think. And you have to really, really keep an eye on that. And so what's happened, and just look at American history, we've gone back and forth, right? I thought when Obama was elected, things were really changing and the country was really opening up, and we were going to have a very liberal, open society, right? At that point, a lot of people thought that, right? And look what happened. Sorry. We went in the other direction, right? And before that, we had a Republican again, remember that? We had George Bush. Before that, he wrecked the economy, or as I say, him and some other people in his, that worked with him, economists and so on, wrecked the economy. So he got thrown out. Before that, we had Bill Clinton, and I just told you what Bill Clinton did. He set up the he said that getting rid of rules that actually set up the possibility for us to go into a serious recession, and so on and so forth, right? So every time we have somebody in office, we think, what's good about that person, but that person isn't quite doing what we want. So we need somebody else or something different, right? So we vote for something different, we get something different. But the problem with that is not clarifying what is our purpose, what is it that we're after in the first place, what is the nature of democracy. And again, just to go back to the way I define in the book, it's doing that which takes into account the welfare of the largest amount of people. most people possible. I would say probably everyone to the extent possible. Right? And we're extending that now as time goes on. I was surprised, for example, when the Supreme Court actually voted in favor of same-sex marriage. You know, that was tremendous progress. Can you imagine? I'm doing that in 1776, right? Wouldn't happen, right? So it's just, so there's just tremendous, and now we're kind of moving past that. People are identifying as not even being one particular sex or another. I may be going too far for some people in this room, I don't know, you know. But some people are identifying as being, you know, I'm not male, I'm not female, I'm this particular entity. But there's a lot of truth to that because individuals are entities beyond their identity. What I mean by that is that we can talk about all the things you like, the foods you like, the things you like to do, and you can say, oh yeah, I'm a female, and I do this kind of work, so I'm in this kind of group, I'm in that kind of group, I'm in this age group, right? But the fact is that when you take all those things aside, people want to be recognized for just who they are. And that's the kind of direction I think we're going in that direction, but then people really react, and they get upset, and they get threatened by too much progress, and then we regress. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the future a little bit. Let's say, off the top of my head, I don't feel well represented in Washington. Is it as simple as I just need to get involved and vote, talk other people into other candidates, or is there something much bigger that I'm just not seeing?
Okay. Let me read you from the book. I haven't done that yet.
There you go.
I'm going to read you. I'm going to start the back. I'm going to start the end of the book.
Oh, good, in the future.
Yes.
Yay.
Okay. So I'll just read the very end. I'm going to read a couple quotes also from places within the book. We can bring democracy into our interactions every day of our lives by providing the respect for others that we want for ourselves. The conversation that we need to move democracy forward can happen everywhere that people interact. Here are some questions to get us started. What kind of world or relationship, family, organization, nation, because I talk about democracy being in all of these different types of entities. What kind of world do we want for ourselves that is compatible with human dignity and justice? What does that actually look like in the real world? What specific steps can we take together to move toward that vision? We will need to repeat these questions periodically as we adjust our democracies to a continually changing world. My suggestion, start the conversation. You might say, well, that sounds kind of naive. How can we have this conversation? That's not going to, if we have this conversation, it's not going to change the world. Well, it has to start somewhere, right? Just so you know, I started telling you about the group we had in 2006. And we've had Democrats, we've had Republicans, we have a Trump voter right now in our group. We're still meeting every week. And what we do is go back to those principles, because we go back to the basic principles about what people are looking for. They are in very many ways the same. I gave a talk about a month ago, and I asked people, what do you think people are really looking for? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Economic security.
Peace,
For sure.
Peace, prosperity, economic security, is that, okay, any other? thoughts about that?
Acceptance.
Huh?
Acceptance.
Acceptance, okay. So, thing is that if I try to get what I want and exclude you, then what that sets up is this dichotomy. And I have to keep you at an arm's length, right? So that's one economic principle. Anybody heard of Milton Friedman? Okay. So Milton Friedman, he was at the University of Chicago, and he was sort of a proponent of what you might call laissez-faire economics. Basically anything goes, and free markets. And so that was his idea. And Alan Greenspan, who worked under a number of presidents actually, that was basically his idea. So the problem is, if you have a democratically elected government, and that government installs autocracy or an authoritarian government, and even further and further from recognizing and working toward what works best for people in general, then you're moving away from democracy. See what I mean? So that's why I say, in some ways, we all started out being democratic. Back in cave person days, we all started out being democratic, right? Right? And as what would happen is, as we got more and more divided between the haves and the have-nots, between leaders and followers, we moved away from that. And so the Greeks made this attempt to get back to democracy, and then our revolution made an attempt to get back to it. The problem is, if you leave everybody alone, everybody read Lord of the Flies, right? You end up with some people on top, and those people want to stay on top, and they're going to press the people on the bottom, and you end up that way again. So you have to keep going back to those principles over and over and over again. Yeah.
I thought, I don't know if you would agree, but to me, one of the key parts of the US Constitution is the separation of powers and the checks and balances, at least when I learned civics back in about 4th grade. And I guess I have two questions. First of all, would you agree that that's a key part of our Constitution and our basic principles? And also, does this exist in other constitutions that we've talked about? There's many other constitutions around the world, but is that something that's, you know, more emphasized in our Constitution? Because at least as I remember learning, that was held up to me as one of the principles that maintains democracy, that no part of government can accumulate too much power. They're always balanced against other parts, the three major parts. Plus there's the, you know, the state, the federal, the county, the city. There's just many different elements balancing each other off. And there's checks and balances. That creates checks and balances.
So your first question is a balance of power essential for democracy? I say yes. Yes, it is, because we can't all have this kumbaya kind of thing all the time. We all get together and agree, right? So my interest versus your interest versus what essentially is fair. That's what our laws are supposed to be about, right? What's fair? So yes, and it is in the Constitution. Our Constitution, as everybody knows. It's also in the Russian Constitution. It's also in the Chinese Constitution. It's also in the Constitution of Turkey, and Turkey no longer has democracy. By the way, I was there a few years ago. You can't really tell when you're there, but you know, so a lot of places are maintaining it. Barely. Greece is still doing pretty well. Some countries are still doing, you know, pretty well. So just because it's in the Constitution, or a Constitution, doesn't mean it's necessarily, the balance of powers is necessarily going to be upheld. So that's why I talk a lot about the enablers, and basically getting the point across that everybody has to understand, children, starting with our schools and their conversations. How many people have conversations with their friends about democracy? Right? They really talk. You do good. Okay. People really talk about anything else, right? Right? Well, let's talk about the weather. Right? Let's talk about what's on TV, right? And when they read what, 50 Shades of Grey, right? Right? So people want to stay distracted, right? So,
It's very contentious, and you know, and that's why I don't do it, because I know I'm against something that's contentious. And at the same, and the other thing is that I'm pretty upset about what's going on. So it's like when you start talking about it, I just have to kind of get riled up.
yeah, it's hard not to. Yeah. So I gave a talk at the Rockridge Library, was it about 2 weeks ago, right? And there was a fellow there who basically said that the government is being absconded basically by right-wingers, and basically we have to put up a good fight. And I understand what he's talking about. I can certainly see, you know, that point of view. The problem is we think that about them, and they think that about us, and they think they're right, we think we're right, and so when do we change that? As you remember, I just talked about Adams and Jefferson. They were both right too, right? And they didn't speak to each other, by the way, for about 30 years, just so you know. So what is it? What is the principle that holds it all together? Trying to get back to that. So what I say to my friends is, what kind of country do we want? As opposed to making it who's right, who's wrong. and how do we move toward that? It's not easy, it takes a little bit, it's a little bit challenge. Just want to tell you about the introduction. We're kind of going backwards, but I want to just quote a little bit from the introduction at the very end of the introduction. Sorry, a little bit of allergies this time of year. Democracy is rooted in the struggle for human dignity. The above definition, which I used at the beginning, an organization or situation in which everyone is treated equally and has equal rights, describes its essential nature. As our earliest societies expanded in size from small to larger groups, we gave up egalitarian self-rule and lost our ability to make the major decisions that affect our lives. Democracy is an attempt to restore self-rule and the dignity that comes with it. But democracy rarely has lived up to its potential due to the ability of some members of a society to dominate others. Thus, for those who believe in democracy, it is our responsibility to discuss and monitor how best to maintain it. This book is a story of the long struggle for human dignity and its denial over time, and how we can affect the outcome of that struggle. So that's in a nutshell what the book is about. So are you more optimistic or less optimistic?
Less.
Oh, less optimistic, okay.
Well, you've kind of confirmed some of my anxieties. I don't know what fears, thoughts of, that we could become an autocratic society, and my question about, well, that's what I was seeing with this government, and my fear is, because I don't know how well I imagine it could be very well controlled, and could pounce on this nation pretty rapidly. I'm not sure that it would do that rapidly, because we would have revolts, right? But it just seems like it would be more subliminal to take over in that form. And maybe I'm delusional, but I was getting that weird sense, like, this is how it's looking to me. But then I'm a kid from the 60s, so, I want everything, free and whatever, but how, if a society would change to an autocratic society like that, like with the takeovers they've had in the past history, not here, but other countries, how rapidly could something like that occur before we're fully engaged in it and have no choice?
Okay. It's usually very gradual. I don't want to dwell on this part of it too long, but that's a very good question. It could be very quick, it could be not so quick. In Venezuela, Chavez took a long time convincing people that what he was doing was in the best interest of the people. And the term that has come out of that is populism. So populism is, I say that I represent the people, but basically I only represent this segment of the people, right? And then I actually try to have this segment of the people that I represent take control, okay? So that's what populism is. He actually was doing pretty well until he actually got reelected. So that took, I forgot how much, I think it's 5 years, I believe, in Venezuela. So their election cycle, he was doing pretty well. And then he was losing popularity because things didn't change all that well. Things changed to a certain extent, they improved to a certain extent. And then he basically canceled a referendum. And that's when it all started. After about 5 or 6 years, he did that. In Russia, it happened real quickly because people were already tired of democracy, and their experience of democracy was people taking over. It was oligarchy. It was really oligarchy, but they called it democracy because all these people were previous government officials. They grabbed all the banks and they grabbed all the steel companies, right? So they said, well, the democracy doesn't work because we're kind of back where we were. So that happened pretty quickly. Putin, within a week or two of the time he was elected, he had his thugs go in and break up the presses at a newspaper that was opposing him. So he didn't take very long at all.
What happens in Germany too?
Yeah.
They're going to have 33% of the vote.
Right.
But as soon as he was elected, he went and basically jailed or killed any of his opposition, and then basically.
He did that fairly quickly, not with, I think he waited a little bit to establish more support for himself before he actually started, but it didn't take very long. He became autocratic pretty quickly. Mussolini, on the other hand, he was elected way before Hitler, and it took him about 8 to 10 years before he actually established his autocracy, so it varies a little bit from one to the other. How are we doing in time? Oh my gosh. Should we end up in a minute or two? Okay. I see you're checking your tape there.
Just making sure.
Okay.
Can you give us reasons to hope?
Yes, please.
Yes.
I was afraid you'd ask that.
Oh, okay, maybe there aren't any, but I'm hopeful there might be, that you might.
Actually, I'm very optimistic. I'll tell you why. Just going back to the beginning of the country, okay? Remember I said about only half the people even were interested in democracy at that time? They had no idea. But when they saw its benefits, they saw it benefited people at all levels of society. Don't forget that once people started the revolution, we were the elite. Right? When they started to see, oh, it benefits me too. Right? So people have to start to see that. And I'll tell you one thing that I'm a little bit concerned about the Democrats. When people were falling behind economically, they had voted for Democrats in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, for generations, from World War II onward. And their industries went away, and they got real upset, and they thought, we'll vote for anybody who promises anything, right? And guess who came along and promised them the world, and they voted for him, right? So I'm optimistic in that we need to recognize that my interests are tied to your interests. And if we can get that message across, then, but it's up to us, and people can read a book like this, and people have the conversation. Democracy is not just about me getting my needs met, it's about everybody having an opportunity to get their needs met. So that's kind of where I think I have to leave it. Unless you want to go on for another 2 or 3 hours, I can do
Thank
that
you.
too.
Wow.
Thank you so much. It's good to have a history behind it,
Yeah.
even if it is depressing. But it's a way forward, so thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
And you can